One of the fundamental multimedia learning objects that instructional developers create is an instructional graphic. It can be as simple as just a picture and a caption, or as complex as a data-driven infographic. But the building blocks are essentially the same: text and graphics. In this presentation, we'll identify each step in the instructional graphic development process and take a very close look at some specific build strategies, from basic layout techniques to composition models, typography tricks, and of course, color selection. Combined, these skills will set us up nicely for developing more complex documents later in the course, as well as help us understand at a more practical level how we actually apply craft theory and multimedia learning theory to the actual development process. So let's take a look. The instructional graphic development process may look very linear, but in actual practice, it's a very iterative model similar to the rapid prototyping design we looked at previously. Now, in the instructional design process, understand that we're in one subsection of that. Remember ADDIE? Analyze, design, develop, implement, evaluate. We're in the development phase. That's what instructional developers are. That's where we work. But within development, we have models as well. And so that's what we're presenting here. This is the typical process. And it follows, like what we said earlier, a rapid prototyping model. We begin with research. What are we researching? Well, we're researching the content. What's the content that we need to put in these multimedia documents, in this instructional graphic? What's the core information that's needed? We then have to have an idea where we want to put this information. How visually do we want to lay out the design? And we come up with ideas for that and articulate them in wireframes. So you might think of them simply as sketching. And it doesn't have to be anything fancy. It could be a stylus and an iPad, for example. There are lots of different wireframing apps that will allow you to do that. Or it could be a napkin and a crayon. The point is you put some thought into where you want the individual elements to be positioned on screen. You then, of course, have to develop. And the development process obviously requires some authoring tools. And the authoring tool we're going to start with in this module will be Photoshop, but clearly there are many other types of tools that we could use. But this will be a good excuse for us to start to learn Photoshop. Once you've finished the development process for the instructional graphics, it's rarely perfect right out of the gate. Most of the time you have to revise it. And so it's a very iterative model. We make it, we test it, maybe have some friends and colleagues look at it, make some decisions, and then we revise it. And this happens several times until it's at a level that satisfies us. Then, of course, we have to export it. And the export file format for the graphic will depend largely on how we want to use it. There are really only three major choices. It's either going to be a GIF, a JPEG, or a PNG. There are others, but most of the time, if it's a photograph, we're going to export this as a JPEG. And if it's line art and illustration, it's going to be a GIF or it's going to be a PNG. PNGs take up a lot more space, but they have this wonderful alpha channel, which allows us to control the transparency of that graphic using other code like CSS, for example. And that's really important for interface designers. If they want, for example, to create a button that changes states when you mouse over it. Well, a PNG is a perfect file format for something like that, and we're going to look at how to do that later in the course. So for now, just think about those three: GIFs, JPEGs, and PNGs. Of course, we have to make layout decisions as designers, and the very first decision doesn't even determine where we put stuff on the screen. We actually have to determine what goes in the screen to begin with. What's the background of the screen look like? In other words, we have a frame, and the frame is typically invisible because we can add style attributes to the frame later on using other code. But we need to decide up front, do we need an invisible background or do we need a colored background, like a white background or a black background or some custom color? If it's this is when we would want it to be transparent. If I know that this graphic is going to be integrated or composited into other applications or other projects. For example, if I were going to take this graphic and use it as a still frame in a video project, I might want to export it as a PNG later on so that it has transparency in it. And if that's the case, then I would want to begin with the object actually transparent. Now, truth be told, in Photoshop, we can change that background at any point, but it helps if we know in advance how we want to use this particular element And the simple rule of thumb is if you're going to composite this in other documents, it might be a good idea to start with it transparent. But you can always change that later on. Likewise, sometimes, or conversely, sometimes it's easier just to start with it white because it's easier to find, especially if you have lots of edges, lots of shape, vertical and horizontal shapes in your design. Sometimes it's easier to just leave it white so you can get everything lined up appropriately because the transparent background will have this gray and white checkerboard design, and sometimes that can be difficult to position things. But anyway, so make your decision transparent or filled with color. The next decision, of course, is what size. And size is one of those ambiguous terms in graphic design. We really mean resolution. What is the width and what is the height in pixels? For most of us, we're designing for the screen. Most learning aids, at least the stuff that we do as teachers, typically we're not designing for paper. Sure, it might be nice and convenient to have it printed out, but most of the time we're designing to have these learning objects delivered online in some learning management system or some other digital file. And that means we have to know roughly the pixel counts that we need. Here are some generic or some well-known pixel dimensions for typical types of output. If we know that we're developing for video, we've got full HD and HD. 1280 by 720 is probably a recommended resolution for most development projects that involve video, because as teachers we don't always have high-powered computers and we might choke on full HD, let alone forget about 4K. 4K is so fat it would blow up most of our laptops. But 1280 by 720 seems to be a pretty safe dimension, so something to remember. If we know that we're developing specifically for a mobile platform, like an iPad or an iPhone, then those resolutions are well known also, and you can see some of them that I've listed there below. So the point here simply is resolution is determined by the majority of devices you think your learners are going to use to view your content. Next, we have to decide what the aspect ratio is, and this is very closely related to pixel resolution. It's either going to be 16 by 9 or 4 by 3. Those are the two most common. And when would you use one over the other? Well, if you know that you're developing for digital presentation in an older classroom or an older facility, and you know that the projector is not a new widescreen projector, then you should develop for 4 by 3 aspect ratios. If you know that the facility or the devices that your learners will use are more modern, then 16 by 9. After all, lots of computer labs still have those old 4 by 3 flat panel monitors. They're not the widescreen monitors that you see in a lot of more modern facilities these days. So you have to keep that in mind when you're developing. For example, this PowerPoint presentation that we use in this course and that you're watching right now was produced at a 16 by 9 dimension, and that's easily set within PowerPoint. If I had done it in 4 by 3, then you would see some letterboxing, these black bars on the right and left hand side of the actual PowerPoint, but you don't see that now because I did this in 16 by 9, and also 16 by 9 is, since this is a video, it's the default aspect ratio that YouTube uses. So all of this information you have to know in advance, and you simply have to make your decision before you start putting the elements into the actual document. Orientation, similar. This is pretty well known to us. Most mobile devices will switch between landscape and portrait very quickly using some of their gyroscopic technology, but it may be helpful to know in advance if you think your learners are going to be in one particular orientation or the other, and you would design accordingly. Likewise, if you know that your graphic is going to be integrated, let's say, into a PDF, and it's going to go in a sidebar, then you probably would have some type of portrait orientation. But again, the key concept here is very simple. Do your research and understand what layout you need in advance before you ever start integrating these elements. So let's move on to composition then. Speaking of elements, what are elements? Well, there are lots of different kinds of elements. We sometimes call these assets, but if we had to characterize them, they really fall into three categories. We have text, we have shapes, and we have photos. But the art of composition involves more than just elements because elements can be positioned in layers, they can have attributes, and they can have effects. So let's talk about this in more detail and let's look at some examples. So in this example here, you should see several different kinds of elements. We see photos here. There's one here, one here, one here, and on down. So all of these photos are separate elements, and they've been cropped and trimmed appropriately and positioned exactly where the designer wanted them. On top of the photos, you also have these text elements. There's one here, and so on. And then you also have these shape elements. If you look right here, under each sum, there's a yellow rectangle here that has some opacity assigned to it, and that actually acts as the containing element, the parent element, for this photo. And it was trimmed over here on the right-hand side. You can see the edges have been clipped out by another shape that was pressed down on top of it like a cookie cutter. Photoshop makes it very easy to do that. But my point here simply is that we have photos, we have text, and we have lots of rectangular shapes. So those are the basic building blocks in this and in every instructional graphic. We also have this concept of layers, and layering is really, really important. We mentioned z-index earlier. Layering is the vertical stacking of your elements, and Photoshop and other graphic editors make it very easy to manipulate these layers. You know how this drives us all crazy in PowerPoint or Word or other documents when you have an object and you click it and you say send it to back, and then you want to bring it up a layer and bring it up another layer and bring it up a layer, and sometimes you lose track of the z-index, of the stacking order. Well, Photoshop makes that very easy. So let's take a look at an example here. Whoops, went too far. Let's take a look at an example here. Very simple. What objects in here are stacked up, are layered up on top of each other? Well, you might say that the title object, How Does Solar Energy Work, is layered up on top, the very top. It's on top of the sun, which is on top of these text objects right here, or at least the blue frame, the light whitish bluish frame right here, and the text is on top of that. The sunbeams right here, these are nothing more than rectangles that have been turned on with a little bit of an angle applied to them and skewed out just a little bit toward the bottom. These sunbeams are beneath the actual rooftop with the solar panels here, so this house building, or at least the roof anyway, is layered on top of the sunbeams. And so my point is here is it's very simple. We take these objects and we stack them vertically within these different layers, and it creates the illusion of depth that makes the document richer and gives the document not necessarily a three-dimensional feel, but it helps it pop off the page for contrast and depth. Now, obviously, elements aren't just positioned in layers, they're also assigned attributes. And there are lots of different attributes that they can inherit. Shapes, for example, can have different size, they can have different position, different color, different border, different outline styles, different densities, different z-index because of the layering, and different opacity, just to name a few. And text has a whole art assigned to it called typography, and we'll talk about that later. But the art of typography is to figure out which attributes are the most relevant for instructional text, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But first, take a look at this particular example here. What are some really basic attributes that you see? Well, you should see, for example, in these top rectangles here, this green rectangle here, the color here is different from this color. That's a very simple attribute. And the sizes are different, the angles are different, the borders are a little bit different. The text, of course, has some variation. Here we have color attributes assigned to text. We have color attributes assigned to these thought bubbles here. We even have these little drop shadows assigned here. Drop shadows really in effect, but more on that shortly. Anyway, so just a very simple point here. All elements can be assigned attributes, text and shapes, and even photos can be assigned attributes as well. So here's another example. Take a look at this one. What do you see here that really stands out? Well, the thing that's different in this one from the other example, what stands out to me is this sunbeamish type of effect here for photosynthesis. So this is obviously a learning object or learning graphic for photosynthesis. And if we look carefully, we'll note that this rectangle, which has been skewed out, has a degree of opacity. Opacity is an attribute. So there is a unique layer in the graphic design document, the Photoshop document for this particular instructional graphic, and it's got an opacity level assigned to it. That's another example of an attribute. Everything else is pretty obvious, the same things we saw previously, but I wanted to point out this transparency effect, this opacity effect here, as it's used very effectively, I think, on this particular graphic. Now, speaking of the word effects, there are lots of different kinds of effects that we can apply to graphics, to the point where you could spend hours working with Photoshop and not exhaust all of its capabilities. It's incredible. And then when you finally get through all of the default effects that come bundled with Photoshop, you can actually buy more. There are all kinds of professional developers that create plugins that work with Photoshop to enhance its effect capabilities. But what do we mean by effects? Well, we simply mean filters that we can apply. These are pull-down menu options that make interesting things happen to the elements within their layers. Blurring, for example, texture, lighting, masking, gradients, rotoscopes, all of these are common examples of effects that we see. So let's take a look at an example here. Let's say we're doing a solar system lesson and we're talking about the life cycle of a star. What filtering effects do you see here? Well, one of the first ones that I see are these blurring effects right here around some of these elements, where it gives it kind of this smudge effect to each of these element layers, and that helps unify the design. It spreads the color theme out a little bit. We also have a lighting effect that's applied here. If you look very closely from top left to bottom right, you should see a vector of this purplish haze light effect. That's another example of a filter that's being used there. In this particular document here, we've extracted the subject. In this case, it's MLK, and this was a photo, obviously, but we've only taken part of that photo out. And so Photoshop has a wonderful tracing ability that allows us to copy out just a subject from its background. And then we can do interesting things to it. And you can see that there's been a Gaussian blur that's been applied to the edge of him as well to make him slide into this kind of neutral color design that we have in the background here. So very, very common technique. Take a person or part of a person out of a background photo, and that process is called extracting, and you will learn how to do that later on. What else can we do? Well, here's a cool effect. This is called rotoscoping. Do you see how in this example here, he looks like almost a cartoon character? This is based on a photo. So the photo was imported into Photoshop, and a rotoscoping filter was applied to make it look toonish. And there are lots of design applications for this particular type of effect. Especially when you want to make the design look a little bit more like a graphic and less like a photo. And a lot of these are simply artistic decisions, but it's a really, really cool capability of Photoshop and other graphic editors. So now let's talk about typography. Typography is both an art and a science, and it's very, very complex. So we're going to just focus on the simple things. You know that typography refers to the typeface. Well, what do we mean by that? Historically, the word typeface mostly meant font, but the modern interpretation of that is collective. It's the font that you used, the style of the text, the color of the text, the size of the text, the kerning of the text, the leading of the text. Whether or not you choose a serif font versus a sans serif font, and we'll learn what those mean shortly. But let's look at an example here. So in this particular document we've got set up here, what do you see in the typeface? Well, you've got some bold text up here and some bolder text underneath it, so some background elements adding some contrast here to pop the attention and drag the eyeball upward, and then you have some subtext here that's a little bit more mundane, and then of course the body text down here. I think Robin Williams would probably argue that, and the mayor would probably agree as well, that you probably shouldn't run the text all the way across the screen because the text loses its identity. Then you'd want to use a narrower column, maybe use 2 columns of text here instead of having the text go all the way across the screen because it's tedious to read. But my point here is that simply you see some of the design decisions that the author had to make with this particular design. Let's say the learning lesson here, or the learning objective here is understanding how you can use different loan packages to save money. Who doesn't want to save money? Anyway, so typeface, several different typefaces that are being utilized in this particular design. Let's look at another one. In here we have a social studies lesson on a couple historical characters, John Adams and Paul Revere. And you should see some differences in typeface, and Robin Williams would be very pleased because there's some consistency. The same typeface here is used on the other side. So there is a balance there. And then with the subheaders, the subheader text here, that's repeated as well. That typeface is consistent. Even Sons of Liberty, the word sons and liberty, those are identical. And of obviously is in contrast there to kind of pop it out a little bit from the design. So the point in this particular design that's worth mentioning is the amount of consistency that's being used here to help unify the document. So I think Robin Williams would be really pleased with the typeface decisions that were made here. Notice also that the text is sans serif. Do you see how the text here does not have the little tag ends that serif-based fonts like Times New Roman have? For screen designs, it's usually much easier to read sans serif fonts than serif fonts. So keep that in mind. Most of the font selections that we make should be sans serif, and clearly there are font types that kind of walk the line between having those little tag ends and not. But for most screen applications, we want sans serif fonts, so keep that in mind. Here's another example. Breathing easy. This obviously is about air quality, and you can see the same types of conventions. You have a large typeface, bold typeface here. The subheading here is the same as the subheading here, and then you have the same font and typeface attributes that are repeated on either side. So what you should be noticing here is the use of typeface patterns. And there are only a handful that you use in most of these documents. You don't want to have too many because that can create what Mayer calls extraneous processing. It's hard to figure out what the hierarchy is of text objects if you keep changing typefaces. So pick just a handful and repeat them. Remember the repetition principle. And repeat them throughout so that you can be consistent. Alignment, of course, another attribute of text elements, very important. Look at the alignment in this particular design. You can see how the alignment here is again repeated. It's the position of the text element to its containing rectangle is consistently repeated for each one of these elements, as is the position relativity to the other text elements on the left-hand side. So again, all about consistency, it's all about developing unity, and it's even down to the gaps. If you look at the gaps here on the left-hand side of the text here, they're all identical. If you look at the gaps, the vertical gaps here, they're all identical, both the beige background gaps, these gutters, as well as the gaps between the text and the background rectangle. This is tedious, but this is what good designers do for instructional graphics. Here's another twist on alignment, literally. You have some similar conventions that we've seen here. The big bold text up at the top, slightly less dominant text underneath for the subheading. But then look at what we've got here with some of these text elements. They're aligned up on a path, and the path traces the shape of the actual graphic that's underneath it, this arrow. Very effective. Why do they do this? Well, you have this containing rectangle, this rectangular arrow that's been bent into this arc, and you can do the same thing to the text. Photoshop will allow you to bend that text around a path so that it can follow that shape and stay bound within the contours of that shape. Again, all about document unity here and consistency. Kerning, leading, and tracking. Here are three terms that are, only one of which I think is really important to know, and that's kerning, but I'll define all three of them for you. Kerning is the amount of space between the letters. Leading is the amount of vertical stretch, and tracking is the amount of horizontal stretch. And we'll look at examples of all of these here. Why are these important? Well, they're critically important so that you don't do this. Whoops, clearly. There needs to be more space in this sign between the word kid and or kids rather, and exchange, because and obviously I have to confess here, I'm sure that this was Photoshopped. No shop owner in their right mind would do this, but it makes for a great example to talk about here. Obviously, the space between the S and the E needs to be wider so that we don't get this silly graphic. But here's a better example where you can see examples of each. Okay, you can't always get what you need. This is just one of those contrived kerning, tracking, and leading examples I pulled off the internet, but it works pretty well. So what is kerning? Kerning is the measure of space between the letters. I noticed that down here with need. Need has quite a bit of space between the N and the E, the E and the E, and the E and the D. You also have space here between the word you here and what and want. So those are kerning decisions. You also notice it up here with always get. Those letters are spaced out a little bit wider than default. But then you look at the words like you can't. And you can't has been squeezed horizontally. So the tracking for you can't has been squeezed in, and it's also been stretched up. So that's the leading. So the leading here has been dragged up a little bit, and the tracking has been squeezed in. And obviously this is a contrived example just to teach these principles. So I don't think it really means anything. It's just something visually that you should see. If you were to type the words you can't in this same font in Microsoft Word, it would not look like that. It would be shorter and it wouldn't feel as compressed. So that feeling of compression or that stretching are leading and tracking. Kerning is probably one of the simplest things to deal with, and that's the spaces between the actual letters. So some terms to keep in mind again for typography. Now let's move on to color. We're going to keep color pretty simple here, but there are a couple things that we need to mention. Most designs have primary or secondary colors in them in some combination, and there's some exceptions, and we'll talk about those. But let's start with primary colors. Now obviously you know what those are, but where we see these in designs sometimes is simple designs that just stay with primary colors. For example, election maps. We see these all the time. And I just pulled this off from an historical election because I didn't want to start anything divisive with the recent and upcoming election. But in this particular design here, we have red states and blue states. And the other comment that I want to make here, the thing that I want to point out, is in map designs, notice how these states have been exploded. What does that mean? That means the states have kind of been nudged apart for emphasis. That's a process called exploding. There are lots of websites where you can get a map template, and even the newest versions of Microsoft Excel include Excel 16 includes mapping apps that you can use to actually put content inside a state like this, so that you can create your own designs. But here's another example that's not exploded. This is probably the one that we're more used to seeing. But again, what I'm trying to focus on here is not so much the exploding as simply just a primary color scheme. What else can we do? Well, you can take shades of those primary colors. It doesn't just have to be the main red and blue that we're used to seeing as primary colors. We can actually add white to them. We can add gray to them to create some variance in those hues. And you can see here in this particular design about global warming, how that's been used very effectively. What's the point? Well, you have to limit the color palette. If you have too many colors, you're going to overwhelm the learner and create extraneous processing, according to Mayer. So using a simplified color palette makes a lot of sense. Do you always have to use just primary colors? Absolutely not. But many designs do, just to keep the document unified. And of course, document unity is something that Robin Williams is very excited, or not excited about, but it's something that she endorses actively as well. Now, contrast that with designs that use lots of secondary colors. And here's where it gets interesting. Take a look at this. Now, what secondary color do we have here? We have green, okay? We've got blue as a primary color. but the dominant shade here is secondary. So notice how the primary color, blue, is being used to pop. In other words, to add contrast to certain elements. Which of the visual elements on this design pop out at you? Which ones have the most contrast? Hopefully you would agree that it's the title, Hands Only CPR, on top of this blue background, and then it's this dead guy or simulated dead guy down here on the ground. Notice how the subject here is shaded in this secondary color, and she's also layered on top of that blue background. That helps diminish some of the weight of the actual title here, and also helps connect the header of the document to the footer of the document with this green color. Very, very artful design here. I think it works really well. There's a lot of unity that's happening in this particular piece. Similar in here. How are secondary colors being used and how are primary colors being used? That's what I want you to focus on. Clearly, green is a secondary color, and it's being used very effectively here. We have a couple different shades, so not too many. But what is the primary color being used for? Well, again, for contrast. We've got this blue light bulb down here that pops. Now, I would argue that this text here probably doesn't pop enough because the contrast here is so substantial, we would almost anticipate, since there's this little equal sign, that this text needs to be really, really important. But it's not really. So maybe, I guess if I were the designer here, I think I would have made that a little bit lighter, maybe even a little bit bigger. But nevertheless, notice how the primary color pops off the secondary color. Now take a look at this example. In this example, it's all secondary colors with the exception of maybe a couple blues here, but we have so many different shades that no real element is very dominant. And so my question to you is this a good design? Mayer might say that without some type of obviously identifiable hierarchy, the eye doesn't necessarily know how to move down the page, and so the brain might waste more time figuring out where to start and where to flow. In other words, which element do I focus on after I read the last? And color schemes are very, very important to direct eye movement here, and I think Robin Williams would probably say that there's a little ping-ponging going on here between these different colors that are somewhat alike but not quite enough in contrast so that it doesn't really pull the eye down effectively. So even though this kind of looks organic because we have shades of this main header graphic up here that are repeated down here, it doesn't really make logical sense as far as the eye movement is concerned. And I think it would be a little bit harder to expect students to understand how to read through this document relative to the other two. Now let's talk about neutrals. Okay, we've had primary colors, we've had secondary colors. Neutrals have a very important role that they play in instructional graphics. Where we see neutrals most of the time is as background colors for text that needs to be read. White is actually a very, very powerful color, as is black. It can be tedious to read light text on black and black text on white, or dark text on white. So a lot of designers, a trend in modern instructional graphic design is to use a neutral base as the background color wherever you have text, like in this particular design here, or in this one here, this learning object about the Leaning Tower of Pisa. So we have a neutral background, and then we have these secondary colors that help unify the design without creating extraneous processing for the learner by having too many colors. Very well done, I think. Now, let's talk about some fun stuff. Hue and saturation. You're going to have a lot of fun playing with Photoshop, adjusting hue and saturation for your homework. So, hue and saturation control allows you to create emphasis, and we see this a lot in sunset pictures. And I know sunset is not an instructional document, but this is so common. You flip open a magazine and you see this amazing sunset, and you think, man, why can't I ever see a sunset like that? Well, as beautiful as sunsets are, the dirty truth is a lot of designers will augment the color blending and the color saturation in these sunset photos for an added effect. For example, in this one here, you can see how bright red the clouds are, and it's only marginally reflected down here in the water and the mist, or whatever this bottom texture really is. And then you've got some starbursting effects that are augmented right here as well. So that white is oversaturated there also, again, for dramatic effect. Where we see this a lot in instructional documents is for emphasis. And one of the more effective techniques, I think, is masking the primary subject. So for example, if let's say this were a learning object about lemons or agriculture or something like pesticides or who knows, and you wanted to focus on this lemon, clearly by desaturating the color around it, the lemon magnificently pops, magnificently contrasts, and the eyeball is immediately drawn to that. A very, very effective technique. We see this a lot in sports videos and sports analysis, and the graphic design power required to do this is very, very significant. Where the players, especially their kinesthetic movements, they might be freeze-framed for a second, and so we'll have some tracing applications run over them to highlight their body positioning relative to whatever the play is. Very, very common technique that's used in sports analysis. So for you PE teachers out there, there are techniques in Photoshop to make this happen, and they can be very, very effective for emphasizing certain body movements or other kinesthetic movements that you want to teach. Shades, tones, and tints. Okay, you're looking at a color wheel there. Clearly this is nothing new to us. We have primary and secondary colors there. By adding white or by adding gray, we create all different kinds of shades, tones, and tints. Now, hardcore graphic designers will play word salad and argue with each other about the innuendo differences between the word shade, the word tone, and the word tint. I'm not going to worry about that. You add some white paint to color, it's going to change. You add some gray paint or black paint to color, it's going to change. And that's what we need to know. What's important for us to know is that there are resources out there that can help us create complementary color selections. And for interior designers do this all the time. Instructional designers and instructional developers especially should do this more. If you know that you want a particular color theme for a design, using a color wheel will help you find at a very precise mathematical level what other colors match the designs that you're working with. And they'll go across from broad spectrums, from primary colors to mix with the appropriate secondary colors that will match up to whatever the design is, and then it will show you variance in different shades. And all of this is done with simple math, but Adobe has a fantastic color wheel at color.adobe.com, and you can come in here and move these points around on the wheel to find colors that match. For people like me that are color challenged and you can't just eyeball and identify color and then decide what color should go with that. You should see me dress in the morning. Good grief, it's a good thing that I teach online. The point is, these color wheels can simplify that process for those of us who find it challenging. Finally, let's finish up with color models. For most designs, we're designing for the screen. We're going to use RGB, red, green, and blue. Which does include an alpha channel, which is really, really important. That's what allows us to create transparencies. Cyan, yellow, magenta, and black is a color model that's most appropriate for printed designs. If we were doing a high-end brochure using Adobe Illustrator or Adobe InDesign to create a brochure or a really nice newsletter to print and send to our constituents, then a CMYK colored color model would be more appropriate. And if we know we're just developing for the web, we can always convert our RGB colors over to hexadecimal. Hexadecimal is a limited palette. All the hexadecimal colors can be represented as RGB, but hexadecimal is a web-safe color palette, and they all have numbers that you can use to represent colors that will be interpreted identically across devices. And these colors are very, very important for web designers. So that's our primer on instructional graphics. Now, we've barely scratched the surface in this course. There's so much more that we're going to learn, but this is enough to be dangerous, and these building blocks will at least get us started with our production assignments for this module. So, good luck, thanks for watching, and I'll see you online.